All right, everybody, we are going to continue looking at these ideas of modulation, and today we're going to learn one of the really core techniques for how we accomplish this. I hope we're feeling really comfortable with these ideas of the closely related keys, because it's that sort of central idea of modulation being connected to things that have a really, really close relationship that's actually going to go very nicely into what we look at today. So let's get a little bit into this here, and let's see if we can unpack this a little bit. So just as a reminder, when we're talking here about modulation, we're really looking for a technique that is going to get to our goals of having smooth and coherent modulation, right? We're not necessarily at all looking for things that are shocking or dramatic. Again, we've parodied this a million times, but if we're in this key, we don't want to have this idea that thing goes, right? We're not sort of looking for this to keep going higher and higher, right? It's not about shocking. It's not about dramatic. It's about something that's just going to sort of continue to create some tension with our home key. We've seen a lot of different examples of ways that we've created tension with tonic all the way back to the major scale. Haha, you're not even in the same room. You can't make me do it. All right, I'll resolve it for you. But this creation of tension with tonic, we've gotten it all the way up. More recently, we've used the secondary function chords, secondary dominants and secondary leading tones, so that if I'm in this key and then I can have some tension with tonic, meaning it's pulling me towards something else, but we didn't change keys. That's what we're getting into now. We're going to expand to create even more tension by actually leaving the key instead of just hinting at notes that belong elsewhere. What we're going to find is that our technique is going to be centered around using a chord that's used in both the key that we're coming from and the key that we're going to. And we're going to start calling those the old key and the new key, right? We start in the old key, and then we're going to the new key. And so we're going to look for a chord that is present in both of those keys, and the term we use for that is we call it a pivot chord. Sometimes you'll hear people call this a common chord modulation. I'm much more likely to call it a pivot chord modulation, because if we've got the old key, we've got the new key, we're going to pivot just for a second right in the middle on that chord, which is a member of both keys. All right, so let's dig into this pivot chord modulation a little bit more. So one thing that's really important, just as we get into looking at this and continue to differentiate between modulation and a key change, is that modulation happens in the middle of a phrase, so that we start our phrase in one key and end it in another, meaning that the modulation happened in the middle of the phrase. Key changes, those big dramatic things, they so often happen in between phrases, right? Like I sort of get here and I get to the end of my phrase, and now I'm gonna change keys for the next phrase, right? Sort of the big one. I can't think of the keys that it's in right now, but in I Will Always Love You, it sort of gets the end. And right? It like just changes keys out of nowhere in the middle of the phrase. That's not what we're doing. Pivot chord modulation and modulation in general happens over the course of the phrase, in the middle of the phrase. And so we're going to start to see that we start to find these notes and harmonies that don't associate themselves or don't belong with the old key, that starts to pull us into the new key. And our best way to do that is through the pivot chord, which is present in both of these keys, right? Because especially since, again, we're always trying to think of this as a way to do this smoothly, right? then we want to make sure that the most smooth way to do this is to have a chord that's actually present in both keys. And so what we're going to find is if you look at a phrase, if you know what key you start in, by the time you start to see notes that don't really fit with that, and it seems like consistently we're in a different key, we've already gone through the pivot chord. We've already pivoted into the new key, and it helps us by sort of softening that motion, making it less dramatic. Not only are the keys closely related, but in fact, we're making use of the elements of them that are the same, that are shared. And so just as a really quick early example here, if we wanted to pivot between the keys of C major and G major, we could use the chord A minor because that's present in both of these keys. So if I'm in C major, right, A minor, of course, is my 6th chord. But if I was in G major, what's A minor in G? It's 2, right? So in G major, A minor is 2. And so what we can find is we can exploit that by just using normal progression in these keys. And so if I'm in C major here, I just got shocked by the microphone. If I'm in C major and I'm moving along, doing C major things, right? Now I'm going down here, I'm going to hit an A minor chord. And I just used that A minor, not the way we would expect it to be used in C major, but as a 2 into G major. I pivoted on that A minor chord, and it helped me to make a very smooth modulation into G major. Let's see another sort of example of that. So with this one, we're starting in the key of B flat major. Right, we're starting there. And what we're going to see is, let's just give this a listen first. Let's try that again. I hope you can hear that by the end of that, we very much were no longer in the key of B flat major, right? Because in the middle of the phrase, we pivoted into C minor, right? So we started in B flat, everything felt very B flatty, right? But by the middle, you can see we're going along, B flat, all B flat things, and then right about here, wow. And then look what does it. We cadence in C minor right at the end there. So let's see if we can actually investigate what's happening. The pivot chord between these two keys in this example is the chord of C minor, and we can see it there on beat 2 of measure 2. We've used a C minor chord, which we can see it labeled the way it acts in both keys, because we can see that in B flat, right, in B flat major, the C minor chord, we're labeling it there as a 2/6 chord. But how does that C minor chord, how does that function in the key of C minor? It would be a 1/6 chord. And so if we look on the left side of the pivot here, we can see that everything is acting normally as it would in B flat. And on the right side of the pivot, everything is acting as it would in C minor. Because the beauty is we already know how to use these keys. We're just taking this little chord that's shared between them almost as like a window between the two keys. Everything works the same once we're in that key. It's just sneaking into it that's a little bit interesting. And the thing that I really want to point out is that the pivot chord here, right? This pivot chord right here, it happens right before a dominant chord in the new key. And that's critical. It occurs right before a dominant in the new key. Because as soon as we pivot, we want to do something that will clearly tell us, look, we're in a new key now. And this B natural, the B diminished chord that we have on beat 3 of measure 2 there, that clearly pushes us right to the 1 chord, not in a way that we're just sort of using C minor like we did on the pivot, but in a way that clearly solidifies the key, right? So we've modulated through the pivot chord, and then immediately we use the dominant of the new key to make it very clear what's gone on, right? The last point that I'll make is that we often see these pivot chords be fairly weak, whether it's Roman numeral weak, like a 3 chord or even a 6 chord work particularly well, but oftentimes we see them weak in inversion as well. And so the fact that this is an inverted chord makes it especially susceptible, or I'm going to say not susceptible, but work super well, effective, I think is a good word for that, as a pivot, because its function is already weaker in inversion than it would be in root position. And so it's a really great opportunity to sort of reimagine its function. All right, so that's a little bit of what we've got going on here with pivot chords. We're going to practice seeing them a little bit more in action as we go forward, and I hope this is starting to click for you.